My name is Joseph Lipic, and I'm the third generation Joseph in the Lipic family. And this is my wife, Joan, and married 63 years, and had a beautiful life together. Anyway, I think we've been wanting to talk about kind of the way God leads us in our life. And it's interesting because we see ways way back, if we go back to some of our ancestors, on how we got into business, how we got to this place, and how we were led to the specialty advertising business. At any rate, let's start over 100 years ago, 140 years ago. My step great grandfather, name was George L. Berg, and he was a captain in the Union Army. And he became a captain in, I believe, 1861, and was discharged in 1863 during the Civil War, end of the Civil War. During that time, he was a stenographer, was part of his job to record battles and things like that. And as a result, he would have dip pens. They didn't have fountain pens, didn't have ball pens, they didn't have all the things they got today. They just had pens that you dipped into a inkwell. And on the battlefield, they had desks, kind of a little small desk, and those pens would roll off and fall into the rocks and whatever. And it was his job also to repair those points on those pens. Instead of throwing it away like we do today, they repaired them. They put a tip of iridium on the point of the pen, and then split it with a splitter, and then the dip pen would be ready to go again. When he got out of the service, out of the Army, he got into business, and it was the George L. Berg Gold Pen Company, Gold Pen Point Company. And so anyway, he spent his winters in St. Louis and his summers in Milwaukee. Now, how that worked from a family situation, I'll never know. But my grandfather, Joseph Lipic Sr., came to the United States when he was 16 years old in 1893, and was a baker. He got married in 1896 or 7, and married Emma Straka. And anyway, he had 4 boys. Emma died in 1903. My grandmother died in 1903 from childbirth, peritonitis. And so anyway, he was a baker, and he had 4 boys, 4 very young boys, 1899, 1900, 1901, and 1903. And so anyway, he had these 4 boys and needed a wife. He found Emma Berg, George Berg's daughter. And so anyway, they got married. She took these 4 kids on, 4 very young kids on. And George brought my grandfather into the George L. Berg Gold Pen Point Company. So he would repair these points just like he did in the military. And anyway, he brought him into the business. And at some point, I don't know exactly how this happened, but in 1905, he sold the business to his son-in-law, Joseph Lipic. And so it's very interesting because I've got a picture here of him, George Berg, in Milwaukee back in, this would be 1890 somewhere. And then I have a picture when he sold the company to his son-in-law, and here he looks very happy and on top of the world, and here he looks very depressed and downtrodden that his son's taken his business away from him. So anyway, it's really interesting if you study these two pictures, and he's kind of looking at him like, who in the heck are you? And my grandfather standing there real proud that it's now the Lipic Pen Company manufactures a gold fountain pens. And in 1905, he got this going. And my grandfather was a very entrepreneurial guy and had quite a few patents on self-filling pens. At that time, between the 1880s and 1910, they decided you didn't need a dip pen, but they would put the ink into the body of the pen. Well, it started out where they would pour ink into the pen and then screw it together, and they would write. And then it ended up with fillers, and they had rubber sacks inside, and so on and so forth. And so my grandfather had 3 patents on self-filling fountain pens. And anyway, then finally opened a store on 507 Olive, I believe it was 507 Olive. He opened a little shop in the upstairs room, and that's where they did business. Well, my father came along, and when he was 15 years old, he would go out and get pens and then go around and sell them in taverns and in bars and whatever. That's just what they did. They just come in, anybody need a pen, and whatever, and they'd buy a pen. Well, interestingly enough, there were some gangs in St. Louis, and so my father walked into this. He told me, he said, I walked into this big bar, and over the bar I looked up, and he didn't know where he was at. And in the bar I looked up, and there was a big rat painted about 20 feet long over this bar. And he found out the bar was the gang, the Egan's Rats, and he was in there to sell pens. And they were all one color, black, and it's like Ford Model A's and Model T's. But anyway, he said, I've never been so scared in my life. And he said, anyway, that was one of his first sales calls. But at any rate, Lipic Pen Company, there were sons. There was Joseph, Sylvester, Emil, Leonard, Emil, Walter, and Leonard. There were 5 boys, and there were 2 girls. The second wife, he had a son and 2 daughters. So he had the boys. They came into the company, and Sylvester and my father got into the printing business, and they decided that they could put names on pens. And so back in the late 1920s, they bought some printing equipment and would print names on the pens, and then they went to a pencil, and And then my father came up with the idea in 1931, came up with the idea of a screwdriver, a pocket screwdriver. And, you know, the interesting thing and how kind of things work out, that screwdriver still almost 100 years later is still the number one product in our line. And you think, how in the heck can that product keep going all these years? But it did. And so anyway, over the years, 1931, he brought in the screwdriver, pocket screwdriver. Then they came up with pens and other products and got into the advertising specialty business. There were three brothers that owned, after my grandfather died in 41, there were three brothers left that had ownership in the business. And family businesses are not the easiest thing in the world. And as a result, we had grandchildren coming into business. I was the oldest. I had a brother, cousins, and both male and female. And so they were coming into the business. And instead of, I was trying to get my uncles to let each of us, put each of us in different positions, and wherever we excelled, leave us there. Instead, they wanted their child to be either president or vice president or something like that. And so there was a lot of conflict involved. My father was president and chairman of the board of the company. And as a result, in 1969, he decided that he had enough and he was finished. And he was 70 years old, and he decided that I'm 70 years old, enough's enough, I'm getting out of here. And so, anyway, he sold the business to his two brothers. At any rate, Sylvester, one of the children, had already left and started another company because he didn't get along with one of his brothers. And so he was my godfather. And but anyway, that all broke apart. And so in 1969, my father said, I'm selling out. And I said, if you're selling out, I'm out of here too, because this is not going to be a place for me with you gone. So anyway, I came home and told my dear wife I had 4 children. And I said, by the way, I quit my job today. And she just about fell off the chair and said, you what? And I told her what happened, and I was out of a job. That was not the smartest thing to do, I'll tell you that. At any rate, along comes a friend of my father's, Charlie Barnett. And Charlie Barnett was a vice president of Olin Corporation, which owned Winchester, the rifle company. And it just so happened that they made a product, drew some barrels, some brass barrels for Alexander, and were never paid for them. I just happened to have a sample of that pen and pencil set here. And this pen and pencil set was called the Debonair, and it was made back in the 60s by Alexander. And this was sold by the National Safety Council. And it just so happened to be presented to one of our employees, Sandy Porter. So Sandy Porter, her grandfather was given this set. And anyway, this is an advertising brochure on that. And that was back in the 60s. And I think her probably her dad or grandfather got this back in the early 60s. Yep. Uh, anyway, so because we owned Alexander, who I didn't even know about, owned Western Brass Company. Alexander owed Western Brass Company about $3,000 for pen barrels, and there was the company Alexander at that time was closed because Bob Sherman, get these names straight, Bob Sherman, who was president of Alexander at the time, had died on a golf course in Bloomington. And so his wife got the business, and so I got involved through an attorney for Western Brass, which was Winchester. Very interesting story. When Bob Sherman died, which was about in 1962 or 3, he left some insurance to his wife, and she quickly went through that. And got to be was a bartender up in Lexington, Illinois, next town up, and so she was a bartender up there, and I went up to see her one day, and to introduce myself, and I said, I've got an option to buy this business, and I was just beginning to talk to her, and 2 men walked in and flipped open a badge from the Internal Revenue Service and said that she were giving her summons to go to court and probably to jail because the taxes had not been paid. So anyway, she just took that summons and tore it up and threw it in her face. And I thought, oh my God, I can't imagine. But anyway, down the road, we worked out a deal, kept her out of jail, and I bought the business. So the business had been closed for a year, and I was excited. I have a brother, Robert, who my father talked me in and said, "Why don't he come with you and be part of the business?" And I agreed to that. And he was going to run the plant. And but before this all happened, I was at the plant up in Lexington one evening. By the way, I have pictures here of. I have some pictures. This is before we bought the company. So here's the 1960 catalog of Alexander products from 1960. And then here's the last catalog, 1967. That is the last catalog, and it has our plant at the time up in Lexington on the front. And then this catalog is 1969. It's our first catalog. Our first catalog, and telling people Alexander is back, and showing different products and insides of pens and pencils and how they were made and so on and so forth. So getting the business started with no business is not a very easy thing. And so my brother came up, and he was going to kind of handle the factory. But interestingly enough, before he came up, I was up at the plant one night, and there was a knock at the door. And at the door were 4 women. There was Mara Price, Orabelle Hardman, Carol Hardman, and Fern Brucker. And those four women were standing at the door, and I opened, and they said, "Are you going to open up the pencil factory?" And I said, "Yes, I just bought it, and I'm going to do that." And they said, "Well, we used to work here." And I said, "Oh, fantastic." And they said, "We'd like to come back to work because we're working for Motorola up in Pontiac, and we'd like to come back and so we don't have to travel back and forth up to Pontiac every day." And I said, "Look," I said, "I don't have one order. I don't have any business, and I don't even know how to run this machinery." And, that talks about the great planning I had when I did this. I didn't know anything, and I had all this stuff around here and didn't know how to start the first machine. And so anyway, they said, "Well, between the four of us, we can run every machine in this place." And I thought, boy, if God ever sent me a blessing, this was it. I mean, just to send four people and say, "Hey, flip the switch and we'll get going." And it was just a miracle. And so anyway, I said, "Look," I said, "don't quit your job because I can't pay you. But I said, if you will work at Motorola during the day, come home at night, and come in after dinner and make whatever, if I get an order, get some orders, if you'll just make those products, then as soon as I can hire you, I will." Well, that's exactly what they did. And they would come in for an hour or two a night, and I'd come in with 2 orders or 3 orders or wherever I was. And I mean, I still don't know how that all happened. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Well, then my brother came up there, and he pretty much oversaw the manufacturing side, so I could get out on the road and just sell. But in the meantime, we had a St. Louis operation, and we produced our catalog there. And I worked in the basement of our home next to the furnace. And anyway, Joan, you want to tell them about that?
Oh, it's a big memory. I can picture it all. Downstairs, well, first of all, Joe forgot to share with you all that when he lost his job, he collected unemployment for 6 months, and we had 4 children. So our lives changed drastically. I mean, we went back to bare minimum, but you know what? It worked out great. We had 4 children, little children, all under the age of 8. And downstairs, we had a side entrance to go into our basement. And I had canned goods back there, and we had a furnace, and the washer and dryer was there. And he brought a desk down there, and that's where he worked.
The workbench.
And the workbench. And my father was a bookkeeper in his day, and he was retired. And he would come in and out of that door and work with Joe and another gentleman from our parish, Al Emmerich, would come over. And I'm not sure he even paid Al, but they all tried to help Joe. Joe would go to the plant for a week at a time. I think a few times he was gone for 2 weeks, and life was going on in St. Louis. Very, very basic. I mean, how he started out. I have a sister 10 years younger than me, Susie, and she would do his artwork. And I'm not sure who did this.
She did a lot of sketches for this.
She did a lot of sketches for this catalog. I mean, everybody was pitching in and co-oping, and we didn't. All we knew is that we would make it. We always had confidence and faith in ourselves and in our God. But one wonderful story is after Susie was born, in 71, our youngest, Joe and I drove to the Catskill Mountains to go to a convention, and in the back seat of the car we had all these poster boards that my sister had done for advertising for our booth. And they were done with magic markers. And my mother had made these clothes for me because I had just had a baby. And we walk into this hotel after driving forever, and we sit down at breakfast in the morning, and they said, "What will you have?" And I said, "I'll have bacon and eggs." And they said, "Well, we don't serve bacon here." And I said, "Well, I'll have sausage." And they said, "You're in a kosher hotel." I wasn't quite sure what I knew what a kosher hotel was, but I figured that out. So anyway, that was a whole experience. Joe goes to the show, and the show was on the top of an ice skating rink. And he goes in there and he's got all these poster boards. And the next day he goes, and because of the what do you call
humidity,
it? Humidity at night, the poster.
The electric went out, and the ice rink started to melt, and all of my displays fell apart. There was so much humidity in there. All the displays fell apart. I mean, it was absolutely horrible.
And the printing was all dripping all
Running.
over. I mean, that is how Alexander started. And I remember being there all alone, and I met a gal, a Jewish woman, and they ended up being very dear friends of ours. He was a distributor. They were active in the business, and we became friends, and our story just kept growing as we met more people in the industry. And what do I say? Our beginning has been a huge blessing in our lives. For ourselves, I get teary-eyed, and our family, and many other people. So we're very thankful.
Well, everything was miraculous. We had one disaster after another, and I'll never forget our best. Trying to think of the name of the company.
National Premium.
No, Bill Bourne, Western Specialty, was in Texas. They invited me down for a sales meeting, and I thought this is going to be fantastic. And I had the Cobra pen, and at that time we had very complicated mechanism in it, and but anyway, and you push the pen together, and I was telling them how we had redone the Cobra pen to make it really top drawer, and they all knew the Cobra pen, but I was telling them how great it was, and I had the point out, and I went like this, and it hit the table, and the whole mechanism shot out the back, and the whole pen fell apart on the floor. And I'm telling them what a great product this was. Well, here, 50 years later, I'm still using the Cobra pen, much improved, thank you. But anyway, it was so funny. They all started laughing, and we came out with an offer for salespeople that they could buy the Cobra pen for 19 cents at the time. Well, Bill Bourne, who was the biggest Cobra salesman we had in Oklahoma and Texas, came up and said, "I want 5,000 pens." I said, I couldn't even afford, because we were losing money on this deal, I couldn't afford to sell him 5,000. And I said, "I'll sell you 500, but that's all I could sell you." And I said, "You'd break me." I said, I couldn't even begin to do that. I didn't have any money. And, but anyway, then we went to Vernon Company, and Bill Vernon was the president, a good friend of my father's. And he had a secretary, and she was a very stern woman. And she said, "You can come in and see Mr. Vernon right now." And I had a sample case. And I said, "Mr. Vernon," I told him who I was. And he said, "Oh, Joe, sure, I know your dad," and all this stuff. And he said, I said, we have this sample kit. He said, let me see it. And anyway, he said, oh, I like it. And he said, I'll take at that time 460 of them. They had salesmen all over the country. And I did the same thing. I said, well, they're like $7 a piece. And this woman, secretary, said, well, you don't get it. She said, we never pay for any samples. And I just said, well, Mr. Vernon, I'm sorry, I can't sell them to you because I can't afford it. I can't give them to you. I have to charge you for them. And he just looked at me and he said, don't worry about it. And bought the 500 sales kits. But anyway, that's kind of how we got things started.